this virtual fireside discussion. My name is Marc Aboud. I'm a director in Deloitte Ireland with a specific focus on sustainability and sustainable finance. The focus of the session is sustainability and the business imperative, and we'll discuss how organizations can use business and finance to accelerate efforts to drive positive global and systematic change. In that regard, I'm delighted to introduce Audrey Choi, and with a career spanning multiple industries and sectors from the Wall Street Journal to the White House, Audrey brings a unique perspective to her role as Morgan Stanley's inaugural or first Chief Sustainability Officer, and also the founding member and CEO of Morgan Stanley's Institute of Sustainable Investing. So you're very welcome, Audrey. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Mark. It's great to be here.
Brilliant. So I think you've clearly had a very interesting and diverse career. The Wall Street Journal, the White House, and obviously your current role in Morgan Stanley. I'm sure the audience would love to hear more about your background and specifically what led you into the field of sustainability.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Mark, I think in the rear view mirror, it makes a lot more sense than it did necessarily through the windshield going forward on the road. But as you said, I had the incredible opportunity to have some very diverse experiences. And so, my first career was as a Wall Street Journal reporter and a foreign correspondent in Germany, covering post-reunification Germany. And that was really a time where I got to see the incredible collision and collaboration of public policy, world events, and business, and just how important, obviously, public policy was for business, but also what an incredible force for development and change, and even in some cases, social justice and equal rights, business really could be and needed to be. I then spent about 6 years in the federal government during the Clinton administration, where again I had this really unique set of opportunities where I was at an independent regulatory agency at the Federal Communications Commission, the Commerce Department, and as Janet Yellen's chief of staff at the Council of Economic Advisors. And so I got to see inside the White House cabinet agency as well as regulatory, and really got this great panopticon for how public policy needed to interact with business. And that kind of led me to, and then I also had some great experiences in the nonprofit world, working with community organizations. And all of that really led me to the conclusion that every player around the table has this incredibly important role to play: public policymakers, non-governmental organizations, and community, the fourth estate of journalism, and business. But I really came to believe that if you could harness business to align its profit-making and growth kind of power and speed and capital and resources, if those could be aligned with public policy goals, with social impact goals, that could really be one of the largest, most powerful, and most forceful forces for positive change. And so that's what led me to go into the private sector, where I ended up at Morgan Stanley, and was incredibly excited that back in 2008, when I actually proposed to Morgan Stanley senior management, to our CEO and president, John Mack and James Gorman, that we found a group focused on sustainable finance. That in late 2008, they actually greenlighted it. So then 2009, despite it being the heart of the the great financial crisis, is when we actually started our commitment to sustainable finance.
I think that's really interesting. And I think we could spend all day talking about your career and the White House, etc. But just to kind of pick on a couple of points there, and I'd be really curious, you mentioned 2008, obviously a bold move going in and pitching to some of the seniors within Morgan Stanley, and up until now, where last month we had the most recent IPCC report. Like over those years, how have you seen the field of sustainability and the business imperative evolve?
Yeah, it's been an incredible growth curve, right? So again, if you go back to 2009, when we announced the Global Sustainable Finance Group at Morgan Stanley, I would say that when I would introduce myself or be in a meeting, the most common questions I would get were, first, what is sustainable finance, Audrey? And then secondly, why is Morgan Stanley doing it? And so, and we really were at the time kind of trying to define and broaden the use of sustainable finance even as a mainstream term. And we really, spent a lot of time saying, well, we define sustainable finance not as CSR, not as philanthropy, not as marketing, but really as how do you create a sustainable financial and business engine to drive protecting the environment, creating opportunities, strengthening communities. And we firmly believe that, and the reason we've made this as a business group here in 2009 is that we believe that if you do this the right way, it is absolutely something that can align good business with great impact. And I would say the biggest difference, Mark, though, was a lot of times in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, when I would say these things, people would say, oh, that's a lovely concept, Audrey. We're not sure we believe that it's real business. Yeah. And so that's why actually in 2013, we decided, you know, we're going to found the Institute for Sustainable Investing, because what the field needs is it needs to know, is this conjecture and wishful thinking on our part, or is this actually real? Are there the numbers there? And so we spent a lot of time actually saying, look, our mission is that we are going to try to accelerate the mainstreaming of sustainable finance as part of mainstream capital markets. But in order to do so, we have to be really rigorous with ourselves and test ourselves and say, is it there? And so, you know, as I know, you know, Mark, from a lot of the work you do with your clients, probably the biggest question is, do you sacrifice returns? Yeah. Right. And so we spent a lot of time doing research, and, you know, I'll just give you two quick pieces of data that I think is part of what's led to the acceleration and the really ability for this to mainstream is we analyzed 11,000 different investment strategies over 15 years of performance. And we found comparing the sustainable investing strategies to the traditional ones. And we found that if you plotted them from a return perspective, there was a natural bell curve distribution of both. And if you laid the two curves on top of each other, they were virtually identical from a returns perspective. Right. The big difference was that in downside volatility, the sustainable investing strategies were up to 20% lower in downside volatility, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. And then when you look just at the last couple of years, 2019 and 2020, we've seen that bull market, bear market, and volatile markets, sustainable investing strategies have consistently outperformed with lower volatility. So once you see that, I think traders, investors, asset managers, asset owners were like, well, why wouldn't I want to be interested in finding out more about how I could align my investment dollars to my values, to climate change, to social justice, if it's going to mean actually lower risk and comparable or possibly higher returns?
Absolutely. And I think investor sentiment is definitely one of those key drivers behind the movement over the last couple of years. Are there any other drivers that are linked to businesses and that business imperative from sustainability?
Yeah, you know, so I think there's a couple of things. So one, as you said, is just the investor interest has, you know, has grown exponentially, really led over the last, what we've chronicled over the last, 10 years or so, is that has really been led, first of all, by younger investors. So the millennials were the first to say they wanted to do it. And then led by younger investors, women, and then the men have come along more recently, which is great. Yeah. But also I think with the increased transparency we have in society, right? I mean, the fact that we all have, supercomputers in our hands. I mean, literally, when I was in the White House, this amount of computing power was regulated by national security restrictions to crossing national borders. So it's such a powerful machine. The ability for transparency to understand what your money is supporting. But then finally, I think it's just been the undeniability of the massive issues that we face as a global community, right? I mean, unfortunately, this past 18 months, you would have to be inside a hermetically sealed box under a rock to not see the dramatic and catastrophic impacts we've had from climate change on every continent around the globe, around the issues around obviously the global health with the pandemic, and how all of those really have also converged with social justice, so that you're seeing globally these incredible big tolls and being really visited amongst the most vulnerable.
Absolutely, and I think you've mentioned stakeholder awareness, you've mentioned investor sentiment, and I think back in 2008 when you kicked things off, from a risk perspective, we were facing an asset management crisis, whereas today we're definitely facing an ecological and a social crisis. And maybe to pull on that thread, I find out there's a common misconception that climate change is a science-based issue, whereas it is a societal issue effectively, or will ultimately impact society. And I suppose we talk a lot about the E and the ES and G, and there's a lot more focus now on the S, but I'd be really curious to get your perspective on the interplay on those two elements, and why businesses need to focus on those as an imperative.
Yeah, no, that's a great, there's like multiple questions in there
Yeah,
that I
sorry.
love. I mean, first on, no, it's great. I mean, first on the issue of environment and risk, you're absolutely right. I mean, back in 2000, 2009, when we started the group, I think a lot of people thought about environmental risk as sort of an environmental issue that might be risky.
Yeah.
And what we worked on really early on was saying, no, environmental risk is not about an environmental issue that happens to be risky. It's a risk issue that happens to be environmental. So right alongside market risk, credit risk, ops risk, cyber risk, country risk, you should be thinking about climate risk, about ESG risk. And what's been really amazing is I would say that, within the C-suite, among the, one of the strongest partnerships that we've had over the past couple of years has been with our chief risk officer, Keshi Hotsuki. He's been incredible at really seeing that, just the way that we had the financial crisis showing us black swan events and tail risk and how we really need to think differently about that climate is really the next frontier on that, and that it absolutely can have impact on your real estate portfolio, on your lending portfolio. Again, there's physical risk, there's transition risk. And what's been incredible is the partnership really embracing understanding climate risk is really essential to business. And I think that's what we've seen also this past, the past couple of years, especially this past year, that CEOs have understood and investors and asset owners have understood that, I mean, when you see the kinds of, dramatic events you've had, whether it's, areas the size of the landmass of Switzerland burning in Australia, or the floods in Europe earlier this year, and the incredibly unexpected, tragic, impacts these are having, I think that's led to this awareness that climate change is not an issue for our grandkids. It's not an issue for our kids. It is a clear and present danger right now. And if you care about business continuity and preservation of your portfolio, even if you didn't care about, the world, you'd have to care about it from a material, prudent investor perspective. What the social, though, I think is really interesting. I know, Mark, we were talking about this the other day when we were chatting, that I think a couple of years ago, I often heard investors say, well, I'm really an E investor, or I'm an S investor, or I'm a governance person. And people didn't really think about them as intertwined. And especially on the S, they were like, look, we get E, we can invest in clean tech, we can invest in carbon reduction, we get good governance. Of course, you don't want bad governance, but the S, and what we've seen in the past 24 months is really people understanding just how involved they are, right? That when you have significant issues of, economic inequality, social injustice, that actually also creates a real risk for business continuity and for clients and for communities and purchasing power. And specifically on climate, I've been really incredibly focused lately on the issues of climate justice and how much climate justice and poverty are intertwined. And just to give you a quick thing that I've been really focused on. Even just looking at the United States, right? So you've got a developed economy, you've got a very sort of sophisticated, highly resourced kind of place. When you look at the areas in the United States that historically, pre-1977, when we had a rule change, that had been denied access to equitable financing for quality housing, even today, 40 years later, those places that were previously redlined and not giving access to finance are, from a climate perspective, on average, 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the summer than the wealthier neighborhoods in the exact same weather strips. Right? It's because those neighborhoods have fewer sidewalks, have fewer trees, have fewer water elements, have fewer playgrounds, all of which bring the temperature down. So now you come to 2020, you've got these hotter neighborhoods with lower quality housing stock. They're closer to pollution in terms of industrial plants. The residents are more susceptible to, surprise, surprise, respiratory disease. And then you have an issue of where we have now of extraordinary heat, extreme weather, COVID, poverty, and it's just been this incredible, really horrible perfect storm. And so that to me is one, unfortunately, incredibly painful, palpable example of how all these issues come together. And we can't solve them in silos.
No, totally agree. And maybe to turn to how business and finance can actually accelerate it. And I know, and I've seen many global financial services institutions focus their efforts towards sustainability and investing in it. And I know yourselves, Morgan Stanley, have committed to mobilizing, I think, $1 trillion to sustainable solutions, and also established the Institute for Sustainable Investing. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that, it's really interesting, like, when I think back to some of the early days when we were starting to focus on sustainable investing and sustainable finance, a lot of folks, especially from the sustainability community, say, look, it's great that you're doing that, but you don't really have much of a footprint, right? I mean, you're not like one of these, one of the mega retailers or a big industrial plant that has this big footprint. So, how much are you really going to impact? And, I always felt like, look, as finance, first of all, we're working with all of the industries across across the planet, and finance is ultimately the oxygen that allows these businesses to grow and to prosper. Otherwise, we wouldn't care about the capital markets. And so for us, I think it was really important to focus on saying, look, if we're seeing this investor desire to align their dollars with things that they believe in, if we can facilitate the investment strategies, the vehicles, the ways to really expedite the flow of capital at as low a cost as possible to those issues that will actually benefit us from an environmental and social perspective, that's a great service. And similarly, if we are able to make people more aware of the risks that may be involved, whether it's stranded assets or other risks involved with things that are challenging for the environment, that's of service. And so that's why we really set this as a goal, and we thought is important for us to be a really important part of the ecosystem. So as you said, last year we were the first of the US banks. The European banks were ahead of the US, as is often the case in sustainability issues, but we were the first of the US banks to commit to net zero finance emissions by 2050 in alignment with the Paris Accords, to join the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. We were one of the first to support the TCFD, and I and a number of my other Morgan Stanley board members also serve on the board of the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, now the Values Reporting Foundation. And we feel like all of these things are important parts of the building blocks to say we as finance have to be part of the solution, saying how do we understand environmental impact? How do we measure these things? What do we hold ourselves accountable? And then to set goals. So with respect to the $1 trillion, on the one hand,
you are what you measure.
Yeah. Well, exactly. You are what you measure. And I also feel like you can't get anywhere if you don't set a destination, right? It's like getting in your car, you got to put in a destination for GPS, right? Or you at least have to know in your head where you're going. Otherwise, you're just going to be sort of driving in circles. And so for us, I think saying net zero by 2050, $1 trillion at least of financing towards sustainable solutions, all that is really kind of a directional North Star. I sincerely hope that that when we get to those markers in time, that we will have far exceeded the goals. The other thing that I just would love to mention that we've also been doing is we recently this year we launched something we call the Morgan Stanley Sustainable Solutions Collaborative. And it's where we actually scoured the globe for recommendations of out of the box sort of thinkers and ideas who are thinking about sustainability at a systems level. And this is very deliberately not necessarily something that you could put into $1 billion green bond tomorrow or that you could IPO tomorrow. It's really these ideas that are thinking differently about how do we disrupt healthcare to make it more affordable and accessible? How do we think differently about sustainable agriculture and carbon markets to make those real markets? And I think what we need to do is a combination of mainstreaming everything we can, but also kind of scouting the next frontier.
So unfortunately, I've been told we have only a couple of minutes left.
Oh no!
But I might wrap up with one final quick fire question. Yeah. Obviously, the summit, the Sustainability Summit, there's many organizations from different sectors that are participating, and based on your experience, what are the 3 takeaways you would offer businesses in the finance community to help accelerate their efforts? As DSO or bringing these forward.
Yeah, so gosh, I would say, first of all, urgency, right? The time is now. This is not a time for gentle toes in the water and kind of incremental change. If ever there's a bold person in an organization, this is the time to have bold ambitions, because again, you only have to pick up any newspaper or any news source or look at anything happening in the world to realize the challenges are moving way faster than the solutions. So one is know that this is not an issue for your grandkids. This is an issue today. Secondly, I would say this is all about collaboration. This is an area where I think that, and I've had some great conversations with real sustainability leaders, like, the CEO, Jesper Broden of IKEA, and obviously colleagues across banking. Of course, we all compete with each other. But this is the time where we need to collaborate.
Absolutely.
Any innovation we see that can really help us, we should actually be sharing as broadly as possible. And we should definitely be coming together on standards and metrics so we can really align to having decision useful information and transparency. And it also means collaboration internally, right? I think that some of the most exciting thing has been how much I've been collaborating as Chief Sustainability Officer with our Chief Risk Officer, as I mentioned before, but also our Chief Legal Officer and all of the business unit heads, right? To realize that this is something we can do together. And then finally, I would say too often the sustainability conversation becomes one of risk and of worry and of, we must stop doing the following. And I think people often lose sight of the enormity of the opportunity. Right. This is really one of the most exciting partnerships that we also have is with the leaders in innovation. With our Chief Technology Officer, because this is a huge. If you can be the company that figures out the best way to do things in a lower carbon way, that uses less water, that is better for the environment, that creates more jobs and that's all innovation. And even though it may or may not pay off in the 13.5-week reporting period, but it will absolutely pay off in the medium and the long run because it will make you not only more sustainable, but it will also make you a leader in innovation and ultimately, therefore, a leader, I believe, in profitability.
Yeah, and I think there are three fantastic takeaways: sense of urgency, collaboration internally and externally, but also the opportunities. It's not all about the risk. Climate change is an awful, atrocious thing that is real, and the IPCC report and other evidence has proven that. But I think looking at the likes of innovation and other opportunities in terms of business models is definitely something businesses should look at. So I think that's us for time. As I said at the beginning, I wish we had more time. I'm sure you've got some fantastic stories to be told, but maybe we could pick up another time. But Audrey, thank you so much for joining me for this virtual fireside chat.
Oh, Mark, thank you so much. And yes, we'll have to schedule a virtual coffee hour to do all the rest. Thank you so much for all the work you do.
Thank you very much.